The beginnings of the Republican motherhood are often attributed to new ideals after the Revolutionary War, new Christian ideals, and the declining birth rates of the 1970s, which allowed women more time to themselves instead of chasing around 7 children. The Republican motherhood revolved around the idea that women had the role of educating their children, that is, educating them with Republican ideals. To be able to teach their children, women had to become educated as well. This began paving the way for women's colleges and other increases in women's education. One example being the founding in 1837 of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which was later known as Mount Holyoke College. Republican motherhood gained momentum through women like Abigail Adams, one of the first advocates for women's rights. She pushed her husband John Adams to support women in his role as a politician. Also influential in the development of Republican motherhood were the writings of Lydia Marie Child, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, and Lydia Sigourney. Many of their writings were based on the early writings of John Locke. Although it is important to note that while more women were being educated and attending colleges, it wasn't fair for the sake of women's rights to education, but rather they were being educated in order to raise their children with Republican ideals, and their education was often subpar in comparison to that available to men at the time. In turn, set a foundation for later women's rights movements such as the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848, where women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott took part in the writings of the convention's Declaration of Sentiments, which became the single most important factor in spreading news of the women's rights movement around the country in 1848 and into the future. It also increased women's involvement with other social reform. Women were now seen as a carrier of morals within society, and this allowed them to become leaders of reform, including abolitionism, child labor reforms, and the temperance movement. However, many women protested this idea, which while increased the value of women's role, but it also kept them in private sphere. Women such as Mary Wollstonecraft advocated for many public role outside the home. Moving into the future, we see a revival of women's domesticity in 1970 with the rising role of conservatism and their ideological family roles, with values that are very similar to Republican motherhood. However, at this time, women are not actually valued for their role as mothers, whereas before in the early 1800s, Republican motherhood brought a lot of respect to women's roles as mothers.